In November of 333 BC, on a narrow coastal plain in southern Turkey, the 22-year-old king of Macedonia, Alexander, made a decision that would reshape the known world. He had already done what many thought impossible. He crossed into Asia, defeated the Persian regional armies at the Granicus River, and swept south through Asia Minor, liberating Greek coastal cities as he went. By any reasonable measure, he had already won. The mission his father had dreamed of, punishing Persia for its invasions of Greece a century and a half earlier, was complete. He could have stopped. He definitely could have, but it's Alexander, of course he didn't. At a place called Issus, he turned and faced Darius III, the Great King of Persia himself, commanding an army that outnumbered his forces significantly. And when the dust settled and cleared, Darius had fled the field. Alexander was left holding something that no military victory had given him before: the mother, wife, and daughters of the most powerful man on earth. What he did with them next tells you everything about the man he was and what he was becoming, because before Issus, Alexander was finishing his father's war. After Issus, he had decided to conquer the known world. Welcome to Venerable Lives, the podcast where we examine the single defining moments that turn people into the figures history remembers. I'm your host, Thomas, and today we are following Alexander III of Macedon, the man history calls Alexander the Great, from the plains of Macedonia to the banks of the Indus River, through every act of brilliance and every act of brutality, to the question that still haunts historians today: was he the greatest man who ever lived, or simply the most ambitious? And is there really a difference? Let's find out. Alexander was born in Pella, the capital of Macedonia, in July of 356 BC. He entered the world into a family where the pressure to be extraordinary was baked into their DNA. His father was Philip II, arguably the greatest military innovator of his age before his son surpassed him. Philip had inherited a weak, unstable kingdom surrounded by enemies and transformed it into the dominant military power in the Greek world. He built a professional standing army at a time when most Greek city-states relied on citizen militias. Philip is credited with inventing the Macedonian phalanx, a grand wall of infantry armed with 18-foot-long pikes called sarissas. They were arranged in a tight overlapping formation that was nearly impenetrable from the front. He was, by any objective measure, a military genius. So, given his heritage, from the first moment Alexander could think clearly about his own future, the question was not whether he would achieve greatness. The question was whether he could surpass a father who had already redefined greatness. The great ancient biographer Plutarch records that when news came to Philip of 3 great victories in a single day, a military triumph, an Olympic win, and Alexander's birth, Philip's counselors warned him that a child born of such omens would be difficult to manage, and I think most of us can agree that they were understating the problem. His mother, Olympias, was Philip's 4th wife, a fierce and deeply religious Epirot princess who practiced snake-handling religious rituals and told her son from childhood that his real father was Zeus. She wanted him to believe that he was descended from Achilles and Hercules, the 2 greatest heroes of Greek mythology. I mean, no pressure, right? Alexander was up for it. He took it very seriously. His entire life was shaped by a conscious, sincere identification with Achilles, the warrior who chose a glorious short life over a long, forgettable one. Before every major campaign, Alexander made pilgrimages to Achilles' legendary tomb. He slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, along with a dagger, and dreamed to leave a legacy like his. Oh, and his tutor? The man Philip hired to educate the heir to Macedonia was Aristotle. Yes, you heard that right. Philip hired Aristotle of Stagira, the man who invented the systematic study of logic, biology, ethics, rhetoric, politics, and physics, to be his 13-year-old son's private teacher. For 3 years, at a place called Mieza, Aristotle taught Alexander philosophy, medicine, science, literature, and ethics. Among Alexander's classmates were Ptolemy, who would later found the dynasty that ruled Egypt, and Hephaestion, who would later become Alexander's closest companion and second in command. What Aristotle gave Alexander was not just knowledge, it was curiosity. Alexander would carry scientific instruments and naturalists on every campaign. He sent plant and animal specimens back to Aristotle from every corner of the world he conquered. He was not simply a conqueror. He was genuinely interested in what he was finding. That intellectual hunger and compulsion to understand everything came from the years at Mieza. So how did Alexander get the opportunity to conquer the world at such a young age? Well, his father Philip was assassinated in 336 BC at a wedding of his daughter when Alexander was only 20 years old. The killer was a disgruntled Macedonian bodyguard, but the conspiracy almost certainly ran deeper. Some ancient sources pointed fingers at Olympias herself and possibly at Alexander, but most modern historians doubt Alexander's direct involvement, but acknowledge the convenient timing. Nevertheless, Alexander moved with stunning speed. Within months, he had suppressed revolts in Thessaly and Greece. He razed the city of Thebes to the ground as an example to any other city considering rebellion, sparing only the house of the poet Pindar out of a reported admiration for his work, and secured his position as the undisputed commander of the League of Corinth, the alliance of Greek states his father Philip had built. Then he set his sights east. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia with approximately 37,000 men. Before he landed, he hurled a spear into the Asian soil from the bow of his ship, claiming the continent by right of conquest. The first major battle came at the Granicus River in May of 334 BC. Persian satraps had assembled a force to stop him on the riverbank, and Alexander's generals advised him a cautious approach. Cross in the morning, after proper reconnaissance. Don't attack a defended river crossing. Alexander, being Alexander, of course, ignored the advice and ordered an immediate assault. He led the charge personally and nearly died for it. A Persian commander named Spithridates raised a battle axe and brought it down on Alexander's helmet, spitting the crest. It was his companion Cletus the Black who saved his life by running his spear through the Persian before a second blow could land. Alexander went down briefly, but came back up fighting. When the dust settled, the Persians were routed, and the Greek mercenaries who fought for them were killed as a message to any Greeks who chose Persian money over Greek solidarity. Over the next year, Alexander swept south through Asia Minor. City after city fell or surrendered. He liberated the coastal cities from Persian control, preventing the Persian navy from using their ports. In Phrygia in 333 BC, he encountered the Gordian knot. Prophecy said anyone who could untie it would rule Asia. Alexander managed to untie it, or rather, depending on which source you believe, sliced through it with his sword when he couldn't figure out how to untangle it, which is a very Alexander solution to a problem. He had essentially completed the mission his father had set: punish Persia, liberate the Greeks, and we can imagine any sensible man would have gone home. But Darius III, the Great King of Persia, had not yet appeared personally, and Alexander had decided that the war would not be over until he stood face to face with the Great King himself. In the autumn of 333 BC, Darius III made a strategic decision that seemed clever, but turned out to be catastrophic. Alexander had been moving south along the coast of what is now Turkey and Syria, heading south toward the Levant. Darius had assembled a massive Persian army. The ancient sources give wildly inflated numbers, but modern historians estimate somewhere between 50,000 and 150,000 men against Alexander's force of roughly 35,000 to 45,000. Darius moved north to cut Alexander's supply lines and communications by slipping behind him through the mountain passes. It worked. Darius was now behind Alexander, camped on the plain of Issus where Alexander's own sick and wounded had been left. What Darius did not fully account for was the terrain. The plain at Issus is sat right between the Gulf of Issus on one side and mountains on the other. The gap between coastline and mountains at the point where the Panaris River crosses the plain is only about 2.5 miles wide. Darius's numerical advantage, the 100,000 soldiers in his enormous army, became almost irrelevant in a space that narrow. He could not outflank. He could not encircle. He had to fight Alexander head-on across a river, and on those terms, there was no army in the world that could match a Macedonian phalanx and Alexander's companion cavalry. Alexander turned his army around when he learned where Darius was. He marched north back up the coast, made camp within sight of the Persian position, and spent the night walking the lines, checking on his men personally, talking to individual soldiers by name. At dawn, on November 5th, 333 BC, Alexander attacked. The battle plan was a product of pure tactical genius. Alexander placed the Macedonian phalanx in the center to hold and press against the Persian infantry across the river. On the right, he commanded the companion cavalry himself. On the left, the Thessalian cavalry covered the flank. He did not wait to see how the Persian deployment developed. He saw a gap forming on the Persian left, a weakness in their line near the mountains, and he drove straight at it with his companions at full gallop. They crashed through the Persian left, shattered it, and then charged inward toward the center where Darius himself was stationed in his royal chariot, leaving the Great King of Persia with no choice but to flee. This is the critical moment that every ancient source records, and it shook the ancient world to its foundations. The Great King of Persia, the man considered a living god by his subjects, and the ruler of an empire stretching from Egypt to the borders of India, turned his chariot and ran from a 22-year-old Macedonian. He left behind his chariot, his bow, his royal cloak, and his family. His mother, Sisygambis, his wife, Statira I, and his daughters, Statira II and Drapetis, all of them captured. This is where Alexander did something that surprised everyone, including his own commanders. When Alexander and Hephaestion went together to visit the captured Persian royal women, Sisygambis, the queen mother, the mother of Darius himself, fell to her knees before Hephaestion to beg for mercy. He was taller than Alexander, and both men were dressed similarly. An attendant quietly corrected her, pointing to Alexander. She had to be mortified. Alexander's response is one of the most telling things he ever said. He said, "You are not mistaken, mother. He too is Alexander." This response was a masterclass in diplomacy. By calling her mother and by acknowledging his friend as his equal in a single breath, he signaled not only his respect for his inner circle, but that she was under his protection. He eased her anxiety immediately. The Persian royal women were given their own household, their own servants, their own food and clothing appropriate to their royal status. Statira I, Darius's wife, was described by ancient sources as the most beautiful woman in Asia, and Alexander famously refused to visit her. reportedly saying that her beauty would be too great a temptation and he would not dishonor his captive. They were not slaves. They were not trophies, but they were guests of a Macedonian king, treated with the dignity their station demanded. Sisygambis herself eventually came to genuinely love Alexander after Darius was killed, not by Alexander, but by his own treacherous general Bessus. She reportedly declared that she had only one son left, and his name was Alexander. When Alexander died in 323 BC, Sisygambis refused food and died 5 days later, following him into the afterlife. This is not the story of a captive and a conqueror. It is a story of something much more complicated. Because Alexander was not merely sentimental, he was strategic. The Persian royal family in his tent gave him something no military victory alone could provide: legitimacy. You see, Darius was still alive and still the Great King of Persia. He still controlled vast territories east of the Euphrates. He had already sent his first peace offer, a ransom for his family and a territorial settlement. But Alexander's compassionate treatment of Sisygambis, Statira, and the daughters meant that every Persian noble and satrap watching knew that Alexander was not simply a destroyer. He was behaving like a king, a great king. Darius eventually sent a second and then a third offer. By the time the most generous proposal came, he was offering Alexander all of his empire west of the Euphrates River, a ransom of 30,000 talents of silver, in the hand of his daughter in marriage. Parmenion, Alexander's most experienced and senior general, reportedly told Alexander that if he were Alexander, he would accept those terms. Alexander's reply has become one of history's most famous lines: "So would I if I were Parmenion." He rejected every single offer, not because the terms were insufficient, but because he had decided that he was not going to stop at the Euphrates. He was not going to stop anywhere. That is the pivot point that makes Issus the defining moment of Alexander's life, and not just a military victory. Before Issus, there was a rational strategic logic to Alexander's campaign. His father, Philip, had spent years planning a pan-Hellenic war against Persia. The justification was revenge for the Persian invasions of Greece in 480 and 479 BC, including the burning of Athens and the battles of Thermopylae and Salamis. He wanted to take Asia Minor, liberate the Greek cities, and punish the Achaemenid Empire. That was the mission. That was what the League of Corinth had signed up for. But after Issus, something different was operating in Alexander's mind. He had stood across a battlefield from the Great King of Persia and watched him run. He had captured his family and seen them bow before him. He held in his hands a peace offer that would have satisfied any reasonable political objective. His letter back to Darius, preserved by the historian Arrian, is extraordinary in its scope. He listed his grievances against Persia going back generations. He accused Darius of plotting against him personally before the war began. And then he said something that no Macedonian king had ever said before: that if Darius wanted to discuss anything farther, he should come and find him, because Alexander was not going west toward home. He was going east, towards Persia's heartland, towards Susa and Persepolis, the jewels of the empire, toward Babylon, and toward the ends of the known world. Issus unlocked not just a military victory, but a new self-conception. He was no longer the leader of the Pan-Hellenic revenge mission his father had planned. He was the heir of the entire Achaemenid Empire, and he intended to collect. Let's talk about what made him genuinely extraordinary, because this story does not work without understanding why the people around him were willing to follow him to the edges of the known world. Alexander was, first and foremost, an incomparable military commander. In 13 years of continuous campaigning, he never lost a battle, not one. He fought in deserts, mountains, rivers, open plains, and siege conditions against armies that in some cases vastly outnumbered his, and he won every single time. His tactical genius lay in his ability to read a battlefield in real time, to see the gap forming in an enemy line, to know exactly where to strike and when to commit his cavalry. He was wounded multiple times, including a near-fatal arrow wound to his chest during a campaign against the Mali tribe in India, because he believed in commanding his army from the front lines. And his men knew it. They saw it, and it created a loyalty that was almost incomprehensible by modern standards. His soldiers followed him from Macedonia across the Granicus, through the length of Persia, into Egypt, through Central Asia, and over the Hindu Kush into India. Most of them had not seen their homes in a decade. The only reason they finally stopped at the Hyphasis River in 326 BC and refused to go farther was not because they had turned against Alexander, but because they were simply too exhausted to go any farther. He was also remarkably generous to the people he conquered for his time. He adopted Persian customs and dress, which infuriated his Macedonian commanders. He appointed Persian nobles to positions of power within his administration. He encouraged his soldiers to marry local women. He himself married first Roxanne, a Bactrian noblewoman, and later Satira II, the daughter of Darius. He was building something he genuinely believed in, a merged Greco-Persian civilization, a world unified under his rule but drawing from both cultures. His detractors called it megalomania, but his defenders call it the founding vision of the Hellenistic world. He founded cities, more than 20 of them bearing his name, the greatest being Alexandria in Egypt, which became centers of learning, commerce, and cultural exchange that shaped the ancient Mediterranean world for centuries. The Library of Alexandria, one of the greatest repositories of human knowledge ever assembled, was built because Alexander chose a spot on the Egyptian coast and said, "Build here." Greek became the common language of the educated world from the Western Mediterranean to the borders of India. The Silk Road, Buddhist philosophy, early Christianity, all of them traveled through the cultural network that Alexander's empire created. He made the world larger, and he did it in only 13 years. But I promised you the full picture, and the full picture requires honesty about what else he was. Alexander drank heavily, more and more as the campaigns went on. The ancient sources are consistent on this, and it matters because some of the worst things he did happened when he was drunk. In 328 BC, at a banquet in Maracanda, modern-day Samarkand, he got into an argument with Cletus the Black. Yes, the same Cletus who had saved his life at the Granicus River by killing the Persian commander before the second axe blow landed. Cletus was one of the oldest members of his inner circle, old enough to have served under Philip, and he had grown increasingly resentful of Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and his apparent belief in his own divinity. Drunk and furious, Cletus mocked Alexander publicly. He reminded him that it was the Macedonians who had built his victories, not his Persian court. He disparaged Alexander's achievements. He compared him unfavorably to his father Philip. Alexander grabbed a spear and killed him, right there at the banquet table. To his credit, he was immediately overcome with grief. Plutarch says he tried to turn the spear on himself and was restrained by his guards. He refused to eat or drink for 3 days, shut himself in his tent and wept. His commanders were genuinely afraid for his sanity. Eventually, the philosopher Anaxarchus talked him out of his grief by essentially arguing that a king's actions are by definition just. which is a chilling piece of philosophical flattery that Alexander was unfortunately receptive to. Alexander never really recovered from killing Cletus. He knew it was wrong, and he did it anyway, in a moment when his rage and his wounded pride overcame everything Aristotle had tried to teach him about self-control. And there were other shadows. When the Macedonian general Philotas was accused of concealing knowledge of a conspiracy against Alexander's life in 330 BC, Alexander had him tortured and executed. Then he had Philotas's father, remember Parmenion, his most senior general, the man who had advised Darius's peace offer, killed as well, not because there was evidence against Parmenion, but because Parmenion was too dangerous to leave alive once his son was dead. Parmenion had served Philip II. He had commanded armies for decades. He was possibly the second most important Macedonian in the world. Alexander had him assassinated by messengers who reached him before any news of his son's execution could. It was cold. It was calculated. And it is not the act of a glorious warrior hero that the legend prefers. In his final years, Alexander's belief in his own divinity became less symbolic and more literal. He demanded proskinesis, the Persian practice of prostrating oneself before the king, from his Macedonian commanders who viewed it as appropriate for Persians, but humiliating for Greeks and Macedonians who were supposed to be his equals. Several refused. The philosopher Callisthenes, Aristotle's own nephew, was eventually arrested on charges of conspiracy and died in captivity, likely because he had written critically of Alexander's divine pretensions. The man who studied under possibly the greatest philosopher of the ancient world had his teacher's nephew killed, in part for questioning whether he was really a god. That is a long fall from the boy at Mieza with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow. As I said earlier, at the Hyphasis River in what is now the Punjab region of India in 326 BC, Alexander's army did what no Persian king had been able to do. They stopped him. He had been marching for 8 years since Issus. He had taken Persia, sacked Persepolis, hunted Darius across Central Asia, crossed the Hindu Kush twice, campaigned through modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Pakistan, and defeated the Indian king Porus at the Battle of Hydaspes, a fight so hard won that Alexander reportedly said Porus deserved to be treated as a king and gave him back his kingdom. But at the Hyphasis, his generals came to him and told him the men would go no farther. Conus, one of his most trusted commanders, gave a speech on behalf of the army. He did not threaten or revolt. He simply said the men wanted to go home. They had families they had not seen in years. They were far from everything they knew. They had followed him to the edge of the known world, and they had nothing left. Alexander was furious. He shut himself in his tent for 3 days. The same isolation he had used after killing Cletus, hoping his commanders would relent. They did not. He consulted the omens, and they were unfavorable, so he turned west. But he never saw Macedonia again. On his return journey through Mesopotamia, Alexander fell ill in Babylon in June of 323 BC. He was 32 years old. The illness came on suddenly after a banquet, progressed over about 2 weeks, and killed him. The cause is still debated by historians. Typhoid fever, complicated by other factors, is the most commonly cited modern diagnosis, though poisoning has been suspected since antiquity and has never been definitively ruled out. His generals gathered around his bed as he was dying and asked him who should inherit the empire. His reported last words were not surprising given his own ambitions. He reportedly said, "To the strongest." So, they tore it apart. Everything, his entire empire. Within a generation of his death, Alexander's empire had been divided among his generals. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt for 300 years. The Seleucids controlled Persia and much of the Middle East. Macedon itself fell under various successors. None of them could hold what he had built, because what he built depended entirely on him. And yet the world he created outlasted them all. Greek became the international language of the educated world from Rome to India. Greek philosophy, art, architecture, and the scientific method became the common inheritance of the Mediterranean basin. The city of Alexandria in Egypt became the greatest center of learning in the ancient world, housing the library that preserved and transmitted nearly all classical Greek literature to the later centuries. When the Romans built their empire, they built it in the Greek cultural tradition that Alexander had spread. When early Christians wrote their Gospels, they wrote them in Greek, Alexander's Greek. When Euclid wrote his geometry and Archimedes solved problems of physics, they worked in institutions that existed because Alexander had decided to build cities and fund scholars. In the Hellenistic age, the roughly 3 centuries between Alexander's death and the ascendancy of Rome, was one of the most intellectually productive periods in human history, and it only exists because a 22-year-old king stood on a narrow coastal plain in November of 333 BC and watched the most powerful ruler on earth turn and run, and then decided that he was not done yet. At Issus, Alexander stopped being the son of Philip and became something else entirely. He stopped finishing his father's war and started a new one that had no defined end point because his ambition had no end, one that would kill him at 32 years old but would shape the world for 2,000 years after. Was he great? By the standard of his own ambition, absolutely, there's no question. But by the standard of human decency, it's a bit more complicated. He was capable of extraordinary compassion, the treatment of Sysigambis, the respect for defeated kings, and the genuine vision of cultural synthesis that was centuries ahead of its time. But he was also capable of murder brought on by rage, political assassinations from calculated self-interests, and a growing detachment from reality that his formidable education could not ultimately contain. He was, in the end, entirely human, which is the most surprising thing about him, given how consistently he tried to be otherwise. But here is the thing about immortality. It does not require moral perfection. It requires doing something that cannot be undone, something that echoes so far forward in time that that echo never quite stops. Every city named Alexandria, every manuscript preserved in a Hellenistic library, every piece of Greek philosophy that reached Rome, Byzantium, the Islamic Golden Age, and the Renaissance, every moment where two cultures met and exchanged ideas along the trade routes that Alexander's empire connected, all of it flows from a morning in 333 BC when he turned his cavalry toward a gap in the Persian line, drove straight through it, and changed the world before lunch. To put it simply, beware of the man who worships Achilles, because he might just become greater. That's our story for today. This has been another episode of Venerable Lives, the podcast where we explore the single defining moment that turned people into the figures history remembers. I'm your host, Thomas, and if this episode made you ponder how someone could accomplish so much in such a short period, or question where ambition ends and insanity begins, please share it with someone who would enjoy it. Please follow and rate this podcast on all podcast platforms, and feel free to visit venerablelives.com, where you can find our newsletter and social media links. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.